You know, the titles of Showa Gamera movies as they were released in America are weird. Gamera vs. Barugan was retitled War of the Monsters, Gamera vs. Gauss was retitled Return of the Monsters, but then Gamera vs. Viras was a weird one because it was retitled Destroy All Planets. I wonder where they could have possibly gotten that idea from in 1969 for a giant monster movie about aliens invading the Earth and using a giant monster from Earth to destroy the Earth. Where the hell have I heard that before? Hey, wait a minute! Destroy All Humans ripped off their title from this movie, didn't they? Hello everyone, I am Zazubaar, and welcome to Day 4 of Gamera Palooza. A couple weeks ago when I released my promo video for Gamera Palooza, in it I released the following statement. As bad as the Godzilla franchise ever got, it never quite reached Gamera vs. Viras levels of quality. Now, seeing as today I'm going to be reviewing Gamera vs. Viras from 1968, I feel the need to explain what exactly I meant by that, because it immediately establishes a negative connotation for this movie before having reviewed it, and also establishing that I really don't like it if I say that not even the worst Godzilla movie is as bad as this movie. And if you watch Godzilla Palooza, you know I do think that there are a couple of really bad Godzilla movies. Number one of them being Godzilla's Revenge. I am coming out and saying that I think Gamera vs. Viras is worse than Godzilla's Revenge. Like, there's a whole other level of bad that Gamera vs. Viras achieves below Revenge. Godzilla's Revenge being seen as the absolute worst movie to ever carry the name Godzilla. Though perhaps except for 98, but it's a different kind of bad. I feel the need to explain what I meant by that. So here is exactly what I mean, and many of the things I'm about to bring up are exactly the problems I'm going to be addressing today when we review the movie. The reason why the Godzilla franchise never quite reached this kind of low is because even in the worst Godzilla movie, and this is my own personal opinion, I know some people may not have this, especially if they're not as diehard of a Godzilla fan, is I think even the worst Godzilla movies contain good ideas. Ideas that, separate from the overall package, could be seen as good. For instance, Godzilla's Revenge. You got a couple of things out of that, actually. One, the idea of exploring a child's psychology through these giant monsters and through his experiences with these giant monsters is not inherently a bad idea. It could be fairly interesting. Even more interesting in that is the kaiju that came out of Godzilla's Revenge. Gamera, a monster that could have been an actual exploration of this idea. The Freddy Krueger of kaiju, as Chris Mowry once put it. Let's jump over to Gamera vs. Viras, however. Gamera vs. Viras has some similar problems to Godzilla's Revenge. It relies heavily on stock footage from previous Gamera movies to fill out much of its runtime, just as Godzilla's Revenge did. It's overall not that well made, though Godzilla's Revenge looks like an A production compared to this movie, in terms of special effects. And also, another thing it has with Godzilla's Revenge is that it almost exclusively focuses on child protagonists, something that the Godzilla franchise started to get into, but quickly pulled out of as it wasn't a very popular decision. There are really only 3 or 4 Godzilla movies that focus hard on kids, and Revenge is one of them, and probably the worst of them in terms of the child protagonist. This is not the first time we've had child protagonists in a Gamera movie. We've had Toshio and Aichi in previous Gamera films. But in Gamera vs. Viras, they really are the main characters. The adult cast, as it is, are all supporting characters to our 2 child protagonists, Masao and Jim. But overall, what makes this movie worse than Godzilla's Revenge? And what makes it and some other bad Showa Gamera movies even below some of the worst Godzilla movies? Well, I'll explain it to you like this. Gamera vs. Viras and some other members of the franchise, though very few of them are going to have as bad as Viras does, with the one other exception. We'll get to that later in the franchise. Is that it's just so completely unimaginative and adds so little to not just the movie, but the franchise overall, that it hardly seems like a worthwhile venture in terms of being an audience watching it. It just adds nothing. It gives you nothing in terms of a good idea. Everything that this movie does that is decent in terms of being a member of this franchise has been done before. Gamera being the friend of all children has been done before in the previous movie, and it's taken to such a hilarious extreme here that, oh boy. But more than that, the film is a hackneyed, completely unimaginative mess. And mess in terms of it just does nothing. It gives its audience nothing. It gives people who would watch it as non-kaiju fans nothing, and it gives Gamera fans nothing because it adds nothing to the franchise. However, I am not going to become a rage-crazed fanboy reviewer in this review, because that would be completely pointless. To come on here and scream and rave about how terrible Gamera vs. Viras was would be a waste of energy, because not only is the movie over almost 50 years old, but it's also a children's film. And to get on here and rant and rave about how bad children's films are is, with very few exceptions, pretty pointless, because what you're reviewing is generally not made for you unless you're a child reviewing it. But that would hardly seem likely. Though many people have criticized me of having too childish of a mind. But I'm not a kid. This movie isn't made for me. It's not made for me to come in and analyze how great of an installment in the Gamera franchise is. It's not for me to come on here and tell how original of an alien invasion story it is. It's there to shut kids up. That's all it's there for. You put it on in front of your kids to distract them for an hour and a half while you go away and try not to kill yourself with the fact you had kids. That's what it's there for. And that's what the worst children's movies are. They're fodder to put on the TV so that way the kids don't bother you for an hour and a half. And that's exactly what Gamera vs. Viras is. And that's not always a bad endeavor, to create films that are just entertaining for kids, to give them something to pass the time. You can make a good movie out of that. In fact, you can make a Gamera movie where that's the only thing to do. You're just making something for kids to enjoy that's going to eat away an hour and a half of their time. But the lack of creativity is really the thing that kills me. We'll get to future Gamera films in the Showa series that do that, and do it well. The next film, for instance. This movie is just an uncreative, it's just nothing. It gives its audience so little that it would be a complete waste of my time to come on here and rant and rave about how bad it is. I will analyze it and tell you why it's a bad movie, but I'm not going to get angry because, again, that would be pointless. But as I always like to do, and I'm not going to go into nearly as much depth as I have in the previous 3 days, I will grant you, like, oh, here you go, as a gift. No, I'm going to do a brief plot synopsis just so that way I'll lend some context to some of the points I'm going to make about why this movie sucks. Don't get angry. So here's basically the plot of Gamera vs. Viras. The film opens actually pretty well, which really sucks because the rest of the movie is a complete letdown to this opening. So the movie opens in space with a spaceship that looks like a series of bee butts sewn together and spinning around, approaching the Earth. And talking about how they're going to take Earth over because it's similar to their planet and they want to conquer it, so that way they can use it for something. I'm not sure. They don't really explain it. It's your typical alien invasion plot. So the aliens are approaching the Earth and are about to begin their attack when suddenly they're attacked by none other than Gamera, flying through space, ramming into their spaceship and trying to get them to leave the Earth. They try to fight back. They try to extinguish Gamera's jets, and they think they've actually defeated him until he comes back, blows a hole in the side of their spaceship, and then blows up their spaceship. It's an awesome opening to a Gamera movie. Because there's this line where the aliens are about to go, we're being attacked by something called, and then he gets cut off when Gamera destroys the ship with his head crushed into the ship, blowing fire into it. It's a great action-packed opening that establishes what could be an epic alien invasion Gamera story. This importantly, because we're going to get a lot of these in this series, Gamera battling aliens movie. We're going to get a lot of these for the rest of this franchise, almost every single movie except for one. So we cut back to Earth, where we're introduced to a couple of characters, quote-unquote, a troop of Boy Scouts, with our two main characters, as I mentioned earlier, being named Masao and Jim, a Japanese kid and an American kid, who were members of a Boy Scout troop or whatever. So they are introduced as pranksters when they screw up an experimental submarine, which is located at a lab that their troop is visiting, and they reverse the wires in it so that way the sub will go backwards instead of forwards, and forwards instead of backwards, meaning no one can pilot it except them, which they use to show off to their troop and to make the scientists who created the submarine look like a total idiot. So they go down into the ocean to show how great they are with this submarine, piloting it fine, and run into none other than Gamera down there, who's just chilling. They play around with Gamera for a little bit, explaining the whole friend to all children thing. This is the first time we get that line in the series, and we get the introduction of the Gamera theme song in the opening credits, but it comes back here as an instrumental. So they play around for a while, but suddenly Gamera and the kids are enwrapped in some kind of big yellow bubble, which is launched by a second spaceship which has returned to Earth to try and retaliate for the loss of the last one, and also try and conquer the Earth, figuring out that the biggest threat to their operation is going to be Gamera, so they have to come up with a way to kill him, or at least to get him out of the way so that way they can conquer the Earth. So what they come up with actually isn't that bad of an idea. After 15 minutes of stock footage, though, from the first three Gamera films, mainly from the second two, Barragan and Gauss, where the aliens probe Gamera's memories to try and figure out how exactly they're going to defeat him. And the footage they watch, I don't know why they would come to this conclusion except for the fight from Gauss, because they watch both fights from Barragan and then one of the fights from Gauss. And they come to the conclusion that the only way they're going to be able to stop Gamera, or at least get him into a position where he won't be an issue, is if they use his love of children against him, and they'll be able to put him out of the picture that way. So what they decide to do is kidnap Jim and Masao, because Gamera was interacting with them earlier, and hold them hostage and get Gamera to do whatever they want, otherwise they'll kill the kids. Not a bad idea in theory. However, what they do next makes no fucking sense. So they kidnap the kids, and for some reason decide to let them roam around the ship free and don't tie them up in any way, and threaten that they're going to kill them unless Gamera does what they want. So Gamera, being the friend to all children, does whatever the aliens want him to do, which just comes down to flying around in whatever direction they tell him to and landing when they tell him to. And then they do something that makes no fucking sense. So they kidnap the kids and go through all this trouble, and then they decide to, okay, mind control Gamera. So they launch this mind control device onto him and now have complete control over everything he does, brainwashing him. Why did they feel the need to kidnap the kids if they're going to mind control them anyway? Because kidnapping the kids is the worst decision they make, because the kids are the one who defeat them and allow Gamera to defeat Viras in the end. Bad idea, guys! Especially if you could have just mind controlled them. What the fuck? Anyway, so the kids wander around the spaceship for like a half hour as we watch stock footage from the first Gamera movie and Gamera vs. Barragan of Gamera destroying several locations in Japan, which is hilarious because while the scene from Barragan looks fine of Gamera destroying the dam, what is hysterical is when Gamera attacks Tokyo, because they didn't want to shoot new footage of Gamera destroying Tokyo, so they use black and white footage from the original Gamera movie of Gamera destroying Tokyo. Are you fucking kidding me, guys? Wow, I've heard of cutting corners, but that is just... it's a whole new level of laziness and just a complete retarded idea. Why would you do that? Anyway, so we get a bunch of scenes of the kids wandering around the spaceship. They wander into a room with a strange tentacle-looking or squid-looking creature in one of the rooms that they think is a creature that's being held captive by the aliens who come from a planet called Viras. and they debate about whether or not to set the creature free. They decide not to, though, with Masao giving us the wisdom of if you were on a pirate ship and they had captured a lion, would you set it free? Makes some sense, but given what happens later on, it really doesn't make any sense. So they wander around the ship trying to figure out what to do, seeing that Gamera is destroying the world. Masao also has a wristwatch which he uses to communicate with the people down below who don't want to attack the spaceship because they don't want to attack it because the kids are on board. Which leads to another moment of complete lack of logic. So the military is trying to figure out what to do about Gamera destroying the world and about the aliens trying to take over the world. The aliens saying that if they don't surrender, they're going to kill the kids, and that Gamera is going to continue his assault. They call up the UN trying to decide what to do about the matter, and the UN actually decides to let the kid, to say, okay, we can't sacrifice the 2 kids for the good of the world. We can't attack the ship. Oh my god. What the fuck do you mean you can't sacrifice these 2 kids? I mean, of course, it's a morbid decision, but you're gonna let these 2 kids live just for over the whole world, over the freedom of the human race? Are you out of your mind? Anyway, so with this decision at hand, Masao and Jim realize that it's all up to them and that they have to stop the aliens and release Gamera. So they decide to fake the aliens out of thinking that the creature that they found earlier has been let loose, so the aliens freak out, wanting to go and recapture him. In the meantime, they go into the control room and sabotage their control over Gamera and reverse it. Now Gamera is set free. And they escape the ship by doing the same thing they did to the submarine and reversing the teleportation ray that was used on them earlier to capture them and hold Gamera, and go back down to Earth and watch the ensuing battle. Gamera is set free and begins to attack the spaceship, realizing that they've lost. We then learn that the creature that was found by Masao and Jim earlier isn't being held captive by the aliens, but he is their leader. Their leader! Why is he in a cage? It makes no sense. So, realizing that they've lost, the leader says their only recourse is for him to kill Gamera himself and then let other ships come later and take over the Earth. So he decides to have a big slugfest with Gamera by absorbing all of the other aliens who we found out were just wearing human suits and all look like squid creatures. They join with their leader and become the giant monster Viras, which is bizarre because that's both the name of their planet, their species, and the monster itself. Okay. And has a big fight with Gamera, initially kicking his ass by using his tentacles to throw Gamera around and suffocate him, and using his big spear-shaped head to stab Gamera. But Gamera wins by getting Viras to stab himself into his shell. Gamera flies up into the upper atmosphere, has Viras frozen, then drops him, and then blows him up. The day is saved, Masao and Jim are heroes, the Earth is free once again, and Gamera flies away with that ever-so epic song playing in the background. Oh boy, so how about this story? Well, what can I say? It speaks for itself. It's a paper-thin, hackneyed, and boring, and sometimes completely nonsensical alien invasion story that just happens to have Gamera in it. The aliens' motivations are nothing new. They see the Earth as a potential colony and want to colonize it because their atmosphere is similar enough to it that they can use it. Fine. But then you've got to do something interesting with it afterwards. And the movie actually doesn't have a terrible idea to put its own spin on it by it being a Gamera movie. The idea of children being kidnapped to make Gamera do whatever they want is not inherently a terrible idea, but it's executed in the most campy, nonsensical way possible. So they kidnap these kids who Gamera has just met and really wouldn't have any connection to if he wasn't a friend to all children, even the shitty ones like Masao and Jim, who at this point have only been established as pranksters, arrogant, and all-around troublemakers. Why are we supposed to care about these kids? and then that would be fine if we cared about them, if we had sympathy for them, and if we knew that, and if we understood why Gamera would then enslave himself and threaten the entire world just for the safety of these two kids. It's the same problem with the UN. Why would they put the safety of the world under the safety of these two brat kids? It makes no sense. And as an audience, we don't believe that they would do this because we don't like these characters and don't understand why they like them. Maybe it's just because they're children, but it's just completely head-scratching that both of them always thinking about the world at large over individuals. This is something that Gamera will have to encounter later on in the series, in the Heisei series, and put these two kids above them. Now, if the opposite had been true, if both had put the safety of the world over these two kids, we could then sympathize with them in that way. And to be fair, the one moment that does kind of work for me is where they show some glimmer of nobility when they tell, when Masao tells his sister to let the U.S. Army attack the ships. That way Gamera's control will be relinquished and the aliens will be vanquished. So that's at least a decent idea. Where it falls apart for me is that they don't do it. If the kids are okay with it and it's for the good of the world, just do it. There's no reason not to do it. It just makes you facepalm. It's just a completely facepalm-inducing idea. But what completely falls apart about it for me is what I mentioned earlier. Why do they feel the need to kidnap the kids if they're going to mind control Gamera anyway? Why didn't they just do that in the first place? They have him in this super catch ray earlier in the movie, and instead of just putting the mind control device on him and letting him destroy the world himself without kidnapping these kids who are going to cause problems for them later, they decide to watch stock footage from the last two Gamera movies instead. It's completely nonsensical. However, I don't think they put that much thought into it, so I'll leave it alone, not wanting to give myself a headache trying to figure it out. Overall, the biggest problem with this movie story-wise is that it's not really a monster movie or an alien invasion movie. It's a kids movie. It borrows elements from both genres in order to make a kid-friendly version, watered-down version of those two genres. You see this a lot, especially nowadays, or maybe not nowadays so much, but when I was a kid, I saw this a lot on channels like Disney Channel and Nickelodeon. They would put out these usually it would be a made-for-TV movie based on a TV series. So, for instance, let's take something weird, like Zoe 101. Who out there remembers that show? And then they would do a TV movie around Halloween time where the characters from that show would have to deal with a haunted house situation or an alien invasion. And it would just be the most watered-down, hackneyed comedy version of that you could possibly imagine. But the only thing making it worth watching is the fact that those characters are in it. We have the exact same situation here. We throw together a watered-down, campy, comedic version of an alien invasion movie and then throw Gamera into it. So that way we can at least somewhat validate the existence of it, aside from being a knockoff of better movies. And then we can release it, and children will love it because they love Gamera, and they also love it because we've put characters that can be their avatars in this situation. I've explained before why I don't think kids work well in monster movies. They're always annoying, as these kids are, but the other thing is that it takes imagination away from the child. The child then no longer has to imagine themselves in the movie because somebody is doing that for them. That may sound ridiculous, but it's something that Godzilla Revenge has, and this doesn't have as much because it's not about a child actually dreaming, but the kid doesn't want to see kids interacting in the movie. They want to put themselves in there. At least that's how I was when I was a kid. I liked watching monster movies about adults because I wanted to imagine myself being one of the adults. Watching kids do that for me is no fun. And overall, the biggest problem with this movie is lack of imagination. Again, it feels like a made-for-TV movie because the other problem with a bunch of those made-for-TV movies I was just talking about is that they lack imagination. They're so completely by the numbers, generic, and uninspired that it's brain melting because there's just nothing, there's no imagination, no creativity whatsoever. It's just regurgitated from all these other members of the genre with a child comedy element thrown into it. And just like a lot of those made-for-TV movies, Gamera vs. Viras stretches hard to fill out an hour and a half, and so that way it can be called a feature-length film. And the stock footage is the most embarrassing part of it. They use over 20 minutes of stock footage, all in all. And the worst of it actually isn't the black and white stuff, though production-wise that is the worst of it. But story-wise, the worst of it is when the aliens are sitting there watching Gamera fight Barrigan and Gauss in his memories. It's super, super lazy because we watched the whole fight. And it's just like, go watch those movies again. Now, to be fair, where I think their mindset was that, oh, this is a movie that we're putting out in the 1960s where they don't have home video. So the only way they're going to get to see these fights again is if one of their local theaters puts the movie back in theaters, like if they put Gamera vs. Barrigan back in theaters, or if we release a clip show of Gamera fights. And that's essentially what this is. It's there for kids and I guess adults to see some of their favorite Gamera fights put on the big screen again. But in retrospective, it completely falls apart, especially being somebody who just fucking watched those movies. I almost considered skipping them so that way I could get to what the movie was producing new content for, so that way I wasn't just sitting there for 20 minutes wasting time watching stuff I just reviewed. So overall, in terms of the story, it's just nothing. The human story, I mean, there's nothing there. Again, it's a child TV sitcom with an alien invasion thrown into it. It's like an episode of Drake and Josh or Salute Your Shorts. You've seen it a million times, and it's not funny in the slightest unless you're 5 years old. And it's super, super campy. I was laughing at the movie so many times watching it, just the ridiculousness of the stuff I was seeing on screen. Like seeing two adults in a miniature submarine trying to figure out how it drives, and it's going back and forth. It's like, what the fuck am I looking at? And later on in the movie, watching Gamera jet ski on Viras' back, it's completely absurd. But again, it is for kids, which I think is the reason why I'm not going to get that mad at it. Because, again, it's there to make your kid shut up and watch it and look at the screen for an hour and a half. That's all it's there for. But as that, it also, it fails as a kids movie, as a Gamera movie, and as a monster movie, alien invasion movie, story-wise, completely. But it also fails in those in other areas. But let's talk about the characters first. All they are, they're a vessel for comedy scenes, camp scenes, and are overall extremely annoying. There's nothing to them dramatically, of course. What the fuck would be the point of that? This is a comedy with an alien invasion twist to it and a Gamera monster fight in it. Why would there be dramatic tension with the characters? And one thing, just to keep comparing it to made-for-TV kids movies, the one thing that is true in almost all movies in that little subgenre is the adults in them are always unlikable assholes. And that's definitely the case here. All of the adults are completely paper-thin, unlikable, bossy archetypes just there to make the kids look better. They just boss the kids around, tell them what to do, tell them they're no good, and threaten them with scolding. That's all they're there for. The only adult characters that don't really fit that description fit a different version of that description. That's the aliens. And they're unlikable because they're the fucking villains. So there's really nothing dramatically going on in this movie in terms of the characters. They're just all there for jokes. They're there for plot device scenes. They're just there to carry what very little story and what very little comedy the movie has going on. And Masao and Jim, our two child leads, are no exception. They're there to foil the plot. They're there for the kids in the audience to, I guess, have somebody to relate to, though I just explained why that doesn't work for me personally. And they're there to save the day in the end, because kids will like seeing kids save the day in the end, right? I guess. And the way they save the day is so just completely unrealistic that I'm not even going to attempt to get into it. They shift around some triangles in a wall, and then magically the day is saved. And also, the way they escape capture by the aliens after they're finally barred, they finally put restraints on them, is they put a rope through something and pull themselves out of it. I don't know how that makes sense. I was never a Boy Scout, so I wouldn't know. But it makes no sense, and there's so little in this movie that actually makes sense that it will be easier for me to list the things that do make sense. Also, as pranksters, they're unrelatable either, because in films, we usually relate to pranksters when their pranks are, funny, and we don't in this movie. They reverse a submarine, and then that's about it, and we're told they're pranksters by adults who we don't like. So, there's just nothing for these characters, nothing for me to talk about, nothing for me to latch onto. They're only there to be vessels for what I explained earlier, and the kids are there to scream Gamera's name over and over again. That's all they're there for. If anybody ever screams the name Gamera ever again in my presence, I might snap mentally because of how annoying it is in this movie, and I'm going to have to put up with it for 4 or 5 more movies. Ugh! Anyway, so there's really nothing else to say about the characters except that the aliens fit everything I just said earlier, except that there's nothing interesting to them motivation-wise. They're conquerors, they laugh a lot, they're just your stereotypical evil aliens with no other motivations aside from, we're aliens with advanced technology. We have to try and take over the Earth. That's just our job. Nothing to them that way. With that said, let's talk about their leader. Let's talk about the monsters, and let's talk about Viras himself. Oh boy, okay, so he's the leader of these aliens, and in that way, he's completely uninteresting to me, because just like Gamera in the first movie, there's no build-up to him. He pops up earlier in the movie than before we know what he is, when he's supposedly some kind of zoo animal, and he's somewhat creepy. They do a couple shots of him, of different parts of him, kind of like the original Alien movie, establishing these different creepy parts of him, and then he's revealed, and the kids are able to communicate with him telepathically. But there's no build-up to him before that. It's not like there's any mention of the aliens having this big monster that they have inside of their ship that they're going to use as kind of a trump card later. No, he pops up randomly, and then randomly later on, it's revealed that he's not an animal and that he's their leader, and that he's going to be used to kill Gamera. It fails as a monster movie in that way, in terms of having no build-up and not making me afraid of, or even think that the monster is cool or imposing, because his design is not awful, but completely uninspired, like everything else about this movie. He's a giant squid. How many times have we seen that in a frickin' monster movie? And as a giant squid and as a giant alien, there's nothing interesting to him whatsoever. The sharpness factor, whatever. He stabs and he strangles. That's all he's got going for him in terms of being in a fight with Gamera. And in terms of his characterization, I have nothing to say. He's a war-hungry conqueror. Think of that stereotype and there you go. That's Viras. He's potentially my least favorite Gamera monster, with the possible tie with Jiger in terms of just being overall mediocre. Though, at least Jiger has a somewhat interesting backstory. As I've heard, I haven't actually watched that movie in full yet. I'll obviously get into that when I review that movie. But he's just completely uninspired as design-wise, power-wise, and of course, motivation-wise. There's nothing going for him in any way. He's overly simplistic, generic, and offers nothing in terms of the wider scheme of the Gamera franchise, in both being in a fight with Gamera and being an opponent for Gamera. Probably my least favorite Gamera villain. But, with that being said, let's talk about Gamera himself. So, this is the first movie where the whole friend-to-all-children angle is overly exaggerated to a T to make it the most campy thing possible. He isn't imposing at all. He's not badass at all. He's a big rubber dude to go hang out with, who goes and hangs out with kids. That's it. He protects them, he saves them, he fights big bad monsters. He is a big, powerful version of Barney, basically, as I compared him to in my Gamera Palooza promo. Again, the whole friend-to-all-children thing isn't bad in theory, but it always leads to a really annoying, campy, and eye-roll-inducing place. It never ends in an interesting or fun way. And this movie is no exception to that of what we're going to see later on. At least in the last movie, as Gamera was being morphed into the friend-to-all-children type of character, at least there was a response by the adults. They still feared him, and still saw him as a force to be reckoned with, not fully trusting him. That idea is completely gone in this movie, except for a throwaway line where Jim mentions that he's never met Gamera before and is a little bit scared of him, just calling him a monster, though Masao quickly qualms his fears by saying he likes children. Don't worry, Jim. He likes us. So Gamera overall in this movie, I feel like I should say more about him than I actually have to say. I mean, this is pretty much how Gamera is going to be characterized for the rest of the series. This kind of boring, benevolent, campy protector of children. And he's pretty much like this for the rest of the series. He doesn't get any more development aside from that. And he doesn't get to be as badass as he was in parts of Gauss and as he was in Gamera vs. Barugan, which is really, really disappointing because Gamera is a badass-looking monster, and as we'll see in later films, Heisei series is badass and can be badass. So that's another thing that's really disappointing about the rest of the Showa series. Since I don't have much to talk about Gamera fight-wise or character-wise in this movie, there's one other brief and amusing thing I'd like to question in terms of this movie not making any sense. Can Gamera understand English? Because several times Masao screams at Gamera about something, Gamera seemingly understands it and then does it. Which is another thing I don't like about his character. He seems almost subservient to Masao and Jim in terms of doing things that they want him to do. When he has his fight with Viras later in the movie, he pulls off a bunch of moves that Masao tells him to do. He flies when Masao tells him to fly. He shoots his fire when Masao tells him to shoot his fire. And it's just like, hey Gamera, you fought and defeated two other monsters before this. You don't need this snot-nosed kid's help in defeating your enemy. Just block him out and kill the enemy. It really detracts from Gamera being badass. I do like, however, in terms of him being badass, the opening scene where he's immediately established as being imposing to the aliens. I do really like that. But nothing's done with it because later on, he's going to rely on a bunch of punk kids to tell him what to do. I also wish that the relationship between Masao, Jim, and Gamera was a little bit less generic. They run into him at the bottom of the ocean, play around with him for a little bit, and suddenly Gamera is willing to sell himself into slavery to keep them safe. I wish that there would have been a little bit of a closer relationship formed. I wish that Gamera had saved them before that, or maybe they had done. There should have been a scene earlier in the movie, maybe a scene taking place before the main story, that would have established either Masao's relationship with Gamera or Jim's relationship with Gamera, to give Gamera more of a personal stake and to give the audience more of a personal stake. Because the only character who repeats in these movies is Gamera himself, so therefore we have the most connection to him. So if we understand why he has a connection to something, we'll have a connection to it too. And I think that's a major misstep that the movie doesn't take, especially in making the kids completely annoying and unlikable. So it has that problem as well. But let's talk about the monster fights and the special effects. They're passable, and that's all I can possibly say about them in terms of not just calling them awful. They're just passable. The special effects don't look as bad as some other crappy 60s monster movies like Yongri or Aegon, but they don't do anything to separate themselves from the previous Gamera films or the better films in the genre like the Godzilla series or the Ultraman series. They look like they were made on a TV budget like Ultraman, though the suits aren't nearly as detailed and the monsters aren't nearly as original in this film. Gamera looks a little bit worse than he did in Gamera vs. Gauss, especially when he's underwater. Both monsters look terrible underwater. It's so obvious that they're little models swimming around and not actual giant monsters. They're shot like absolute garbage, and they just look like crap. And there's a lot of underwater sequences in this movie of Gamera fighting Viras underwater, of Gamera playing around with the kids underwater, that so much of it takes place underwater that it should look better than it actually does. Not that the land and air scenes look much better. When Gamera is flying with Viras up into the air, it doesn't look quite as bad as it does when they're fighting underwater, but it doesn't look much better. It just looks like a flying top going up into the air. It doesn't look like two organic creatures locked in combat, like most of the parts of Gamera vs. Gauss did, despite Gauss not looking that good in that movie. But their fights looked way more dynamic and interesting than these fights do. They're just, overall, the battle itself, because there's only one monster fight in this movie that isn't stock footage, is just overall uninteresting. And it just sucks. It's just bland. An octopus fighting a bigger monster, kind of like King Kong versus Godzilla, or the opening scene of War of the Gargantuas. So it adds nothing to the wider universe of giant monster movies, and nothing to the Gamera franchise, because while this is the first time Gamera has fought a tentacled foe, it's not like this is one of Gamera's better battles anyway. It's pretty basic, and you never at any point think that Gamera is not going to be able to defeat him. I also don't understand how Viras is not only able to stab Gamera when... it makes no sense. How is Viras able to raise himself up and then come down on Gamera? How is he able to do that? He can't fly or anything. He just kind of stabs him. It makes no sense. And also, how the fuck is Viras able to get through Gamera's defenses? Gamera was able to survive a nuclear bomb in the first movie. How is one giant squid able to stab him? Especially when the creature was human-sized earlier. It makes no sense. But in terms of the special effects overall, it's even worse when you compare the effects made for this movie to the stock footage, particularly from Gamera vs. Berrigan, because they look so much better. The stuff shot for this movie looks like it was shot so much quicker and lazier, and doesn't look nearly as elaborate or as visually interesting as Berrigan did. And Gauss even though that movie doesn't look quite as good as Berrigan did. And need I discuss the laziness and absolute laughability of using black and white stock footage to show Gamera destroying Tokyo? That pretty much speaks for itself on how bad that is. And it kind of embodies the movie overall. The film is a lazy, uncreative, unimaginative rehash that's just made to distract children from annoying their parents. It offers its audience nothing in terms of a fun monster battling aliens movie, because all of its aspects in those genres have been seen a million times and been done a million times better in past Godzilla movies, and it will be done better in future Gamera films. And it gives Gamera fans nothing in terms of being an effective installment in the franchise. The new monster is worthless. The fight is just kind of generic. It offers nothing in terms of being a great Gamera battle. And in terms of the story, well, I've already talked about that. That pretty much speaks for itself. Again, it's not bad in theory in terms of kids being kidnapped to get Gamera to do something, but the way it's done is so campy, uninteresting, and completely pointless by the end that it's hardly worth mentioning. So overall, this is one of the worst Gamera movies ever made, in my opinion. It's lazy, it's unimaginative, it's just nothing. It's just completely, it's drivel. It's just, again, it's there to distract kids from annoying their parents. And overall, honestly, if you got a 3 or 4 year old running around the house bothering you who happens to like giant monster movies, I guess throwing this on the TV wouldn't be the worst thing ever. It's entertaining for kids because kids won't put anything near like the thought I'm putting into it, and they'll put about as much thought into it as the filmmakers did making the movie. So if you've got nothing else except Gamera vs. Viras to put on the TV to distract and entertain your kids, there are way worse things they could be doing, so why not? Throw it on the TV. They'll find it entertaining, I guess. But again, there's better options out there. The next Gamera movie would be such a better option to put on there because it's got some imagination to it. But we'll get into that next time. But overall rating, I am going to give Gamera vs. Viras a 1 out of 5. It gets a 0.5 for me for the decent idea of kidnapping kids to fight to get Gamera to do something, and a 0.5 for the decent special effects in the end fight scene. But overall, this movie is not worth watching. It adds nothing to the franchise. There's nothing here in terms of a monster movie, very little in terms of alien invasion movie, and as a movie overall, I don't think I need to explain why it's not worth watching in terms of that. So that is my review of 1968's Gamera vs. Viras. And this will begin our long trudge through the generic, poorly made for kids installments in the Showa Gamera series. I hope you'll stick with me through this sad time, but fortunately next time we'll get a little bit of an improvement over this complete disaster. when we get into a Gamera movie that, while not a good movie, certainly has more imagination than this piece of crap. When we get into 1969's Gamera vs. Guiron. I hope you guys will join me for that review. Sayonara, kids.